Why do young women hate men? There you go. What I've been saying all along. They're they're proving me right. Let's hear what these gals have to say.
Really fascinating results. One of the starkest findings was how negatively young women feel towards men.
Notice it's fascinating when women hate men. When men hate women, which is never, but if they did, it wouldn't be fascinating, guys. He's like, this is atrocious and something has to be done about this. That's what her attitude would be then.
Compared with the other way around. Can you unpack some of the stats for us, please?
Yeah, I think out of everything we found, this is what jumped out the most to me. I think we're very used to hearing about young men's negative views of young women's, and sort of, misogyny amongst young men.
Men's negative views is basically two things. They're rejecting me and they sleep with other guys, right? Men worship women otherwise. These were women. They know, they feel exactly like the women they're talking about.
But this really struck me because we found that, 72% of young men have a favorable view of young women, 7%.
Yeah, 72. It's actually a lot larger than that because the negatives have very little negative. The biggest negative thing you will hear from guys is like, she she avoids accountability. That's what men say, right?
So not very many really, have an unfavourable view of young women. When it comes to women under 30, though, only 50% have a favourable view. The unfavourable view of men goes up to 21%. And then under 25 women, it's just 35% of young women who have a favourable view of men. And if you go into very
I would like to know their idea of favorable. Because if it was really 35%, that's actually a fairly big percentage. It was that high that these guys would be shacking up with these women. So I'd like to know their criteria. What do they consider favorable?
favourable, we actually use positive rather than favourable. But if you say very positive, it's just 11% of under 25 women. So we are looking at an environment where young women feel a lot more negatively towards young men than the other way around.
There you go. That's what I've been saying the whole time. And it's pretty obvious too.
Really interesting because I think if you sort of, as a casual observer of some of the discourse about sort of gender politics and particularly the manosphere, you'd assume that this sort of rift between young women and young men was driven by young men's opinions and behaviour towards women. Perhaps it is.
Of course, you assume that men are always to blame. Men are always to blame for women's behavior.
We'll get more into the reasons behind some of these figures. But really, I mean, it's much more stark on the side of women's attitudes.
Exactly. And it's not even reciprocated, on the young men's side. It really is unbalanced, with young women feeling much more negatively than young men.
Yeah. And Emily, you spent a lot of time with this demographic of young women for your feature. How was this negativity towards men shaping their lives? How did it come out when you were speaking to them?
I was really, really surprised by how negatively they spoke about men.
What do you mean you're surprised? You're a young woman yourself. You speak negatively about us. Like the gaslighting.
And I mean, some of them still had boyfriends and still were dating, although some of them were even quite negative about.
There you go, guys. Some of them were still had boyfriends and dating. See, guys will take anything. Guys will shack up with a woman who hates his guts. All those famous feminists from the 1960s, or at least most of them, had boyfriends or husbands. And that's what guys do. They shack up with women that they know hate their guts.
The men they were dating. One girl I spoke to was like, I can't imagine my boyfriend at the pub with his friends talking about political issues, whereas that's basically all me and my friends talk about. So, she felt quite scathing towards, even though she loved him, she felt quite scathing towards him. And some
She didn't love him. You're lying. She didn't love him at all. She scathed at him because she hated his guts. She was using him. Or I should say she is using him.
Some women I spoke to had basically sworn off men completely and said they were uninterested in them, didn't have male friends. They all said they would not date a man who didn't share their basic views, and given...
Submit. That's what their basic views is. It's submit. a man who didn't submit to them 100%. And even then, it's a failure because they hate those guys.
Women and men don't have exactly the same politics, and that's going to become more tricky if women are just totally not up for dating a man who disagrees with them on core issues. They viewed that as an absolutely uncompromising moral standpoint.
Yeah.
A woman's politics is based entirely on her sex. Men's politics, it covers the gambit. But women are only concerned about themselves as women. If you took away a woman's sex, she would have no identity.
I thought that was really interesting because it becomes really pronounced when it gets down to particular political and social issues. So 6 in 10 say they would find it difficult to date someone who disagreed with them on the Palestine-Israel conflict or who didn't share their views on Donald Trump. And Emily, did you get a sense of why?
That's the only thing I actually would support them with, right? If you're supporting Trump or back in the other side, what she did, I'm not going to say it. I mean, there's something that's got to be wrong with you at this point.
I mean, you spoke to some influencers, actually, and we often talk about these influencers in the manosphere who are leading boys astray. But in a way, there's something...
Oh, so yeah, how are they leading them astray? I could say it's because most of them are grifters and pickup artists and using guys, right? But these women are saying, hey, they may say something that is truthful and negative about my gender. That's what she means when she says lead astray.
Thing sort of reflecting what's going on the male side of things going on for women. Had they been sort of influenced by things that they were seeing online?
Yes, I mean, I think men and women are looking at very, very different internets now, young men and young women. Like the women I spoke to said they were worried about what the men were looking at online. They're worried about, Andrew Tate's and people like that.
Yeah.
Whereas...
They always bring up Tate's, but they don't care about Tate. What they're worried about, they're just lying when they say that. They're worried about men finding some kind of self-respect or rejecting them altogether. Because even though these women hate these guys, hate us guys, they still want to use us.
I spoke to an influencer who would post very, very left-wing content, very sort of anti-imperialist, very pro-Palestine, very anti the government, anti-Starmer, anti-Trump, but also there is mixed in content about, and with her and people like her, about toxic masculinity, about manufactured male victimhood.
Okay, so she's not left-wing then. She's feminist, and that's a far-right movement, whatever your name is. Feminism is far-right. It's far-right, it's authoritarian, it's a hate movement. So she's not left-wing.
Things like that, it all kind of blurs into a larger online space where that has a significant antipathy towards men alongside progressive politics.
Yeah, I found it interesting, actually. That's something that
Well, she's not progressive. She's part of a hate movement. She's not progressive. An actual left-wing party would reject feminism, along with the KKK and other hate movements.
I've come across on my own feed, lots of, as a mum of a first child, like she's a toddler, I've got a lot of parenting content coming through on Instagram Reels in particular, and it's a lot of women basically being so horrible about their husbands and the fathers of their children.
Totally.
There you go. These women are shacking up with men. They hate them. And yet they're using them. That's what's going on. Your gender is using my gender while spitting on it.
Weaponized incompetence and all of these kind of buzz phrases. And I come off it, and I don't recognize that in my own partner or many people that I know, but I do get a sense that there is a lot of...
Well, you're not like the other girls.
There is a lot of frustration and hatred for the opposite sex out there.
100%.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you for admitting it. This is 25 minutes long, guys. I don't know if I'll bother going through it because I haven't watched all of this yet. These women basically proved my point in the first 4.5. We'll see if it's if I'm wasting my time going further.
The girls I spoke to, I didn't put this in the piece, but they all watched this content about brides being humiliated at their weddings by their husbands. That's a real genre of content. I think a lot of these skits they're scripted, but they'd all watch this stuff, and that was
Yeah, they're scripted, all right. I believe that 100%.
specific thing for them. That's just, men can be so horrible, you can't trust them.
Oh, almost like to drive their rage, kind of.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, just as you see these skits drive to enrage men, there is the same version for women as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, what can I say? You know what? They have no real troubles in their lives. They have no obstacles. Because if they did, they wouldn't bother men like they do. They would still bother men and still use us. But they'd be distracted. Like, because these women have zero problems. All they can do is find somewhere to put their rage to, their hatred. I won't say rage, it's hatred.
And what is making women feel so disaffected, Scarlett, who you've studied in this polling? I mean, you find that they're very, very pessimistic.
They don't feel disaffected. They feel privileged to attack my gender, and they love it. They feel privileged to have practiced their innate sadism.
Pessimistic about their own economic outlook.
Yeah. They're hugely pessimistic about their own economic outlook. They don't think the economy is working for them, which I think is partly then why they have a more favourable view of communism than capitalism, why they think...
None of you women will ever become communist. None of you. Because a communistic system won't provide you with luxuries. Only a capitalist system will. All you women are hardcore capitalist, and you'll always remain so.
Think the economy is stacked against them in a way that the young men feel less strongly. And what I find about that is I think it's really interesting, because I think it's very clear to me that the economy is not working for young people generally. You know, if you look at the youth unemployment rate, if you look...
Yeah, so how do you gear this towards women's hatred of men? Well, my version, I shouldn't say version, my observation is women's going to hate men no matter what. But what they're angry about is that they've stopped men from achieving out of their sadism. And now they're angry that they're not making enough money to be worth using. Remember, your sex is chasing my sex out of universities. You're stunting our ability to make money. And now you're saying, hey, my little slave boys, they're not built, they're not growing enough crops for me.
Student loans, it's very hard to make your way as a young person, I think, at the moment in this country. But I think what's interesting is that young women feel so much more pessimistically about it than young men, even though actually they're all in a bad situation, but women are in a better position than men overall. So,
There you go. Thanks for admitting all this. This is gold. Women always have it easier than men, and yet they're the ones getting angry. The male gender, the male sex is so beaten down that we just accept it, right? But the upper class here, that's your gender, you can't get over it.
Female youth employment stats are much better than male ones. Again, female earnings now for these younger generations have surpassed male earnings. So actually, yes, I think it's sort of absolutely right that they're feeling frustrated. But I still can't quite explain how much more pessimistically they feel, and that is even more pronounced actually amongst it's a bit of an awful pollster term, but
well, they have nothing. Do they have no hurdles in life? So they have no ability to appreciate what they've got. If everything you got was given to you for free, why would you appreciate it?
ABC1 women
Okay.
rather than C2DE. So sort of middle class, more affluent young women in this country are the ones that feel those negative feelings towards the economy, towards how that system works, and much more pessimistic about their life chances than those from more working class backgrounds and in more
What did I just tell you? Thank you for supporting what I just said.
working class professions.
That's really interesting. And did you find that those more middle class professional women had a more negative view of men than the...
Yeah, and they had a more negative view basically across the board as well.
Right.
So they were more likely to think the country is racist, for example, more likely to think that the country is sexist, more likely to...
Those upper class women are the most sexist and racist people in the country.
feel pessimistic about their own chances, more likely to feel pessimistic about how the economy works. Basically, anything you can mention, that they were more negative.
And Emily, did you get any insight at all into why that might be? Because obviously, and you mentioned some of the issues that generation are facing there, Scarlett. You know, housing shortages, high student debt, and men are in that position too. So why is it that women are coming out with a different outlook?
It's a really good question. I mean,
It's very easy to answer. They're privileged. They never had to fight for anything, and they just naturally hate men. Right? There's no gladiatorial ring for them to go to and get their bloodlust over, right?
I think a big part is the internet. Your polling showed that women who are more online feel a lot of this stuff more strongly, are more worried about things like abortion rights and the environment. I think they would put it, if you ask them, their main answer is women are more empathetic than men. We naturally experience misogyny from a young age.
Yeah, those are lies. If you were empathetic, you would never hate men. You'd feel empathy for us and see what we go through. And misogyny doesn't exist, whoever you are. Men worship women. But misandry, according to you, is everywhere.
Experience sexual violence, or we witness sexual violence. We experience sort of, a lot of them had a...
You mean like circumcision? Being cut as a baby? That only happens to little boys, not your gender.
What could be almost reactionary way of talking about sort of, we experience physical pain, and that in our bodies creates this greater sense of feeling and empathy compared to men. It's
bullshit. No, you don't. No, you don't. You are the most callous gender that has ever existed.
It's a very sort of biologically essentialist way, in a way, of talking about one's politics.
Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting hearing these young women who are extremely progressive in their values and their mindset.
No, they're extremely regressive. That's what they are. And you know something, guys? You'll hear this, hey, double standards. Women can take pain better than men because they give birth, but somehow they feel pain better. Do you see what's going on here?
Also saying things that you kind of expect from an older,
totally,
maybe less online generation, like, oh, they're just different,
Yeah, they really root it in their biology.
Yeah.
And they would say, yeah, we've experienced that, and therefore, I've experienced misogyny, and therefore I can now empathise with people who experience racism, if they're white, for example, or, classism, and we can just start caring about things. Men never started feeling oppression, so they've never had to care.
Yeah, they're virtue signaling. You gals are great at virtue signaling.
Yeah. And I think, there's obviously a point in that. There obviously, I think a lot of young women growing up will have experienced a friend who suffered sexual violence, if not them.
No, that's a bunch of horseshit. That's lies. Every time I hear one of those stories, I said, yeah, that's just a lie.
There are those kind of things that can make you aware. But I think also then they go on the internet and it completely reinforces those beliefs and tells them that you should be concerned, and it's a very, very moral issue to not be, and it's a problem if you're not concerned, and you shouldn't be relaxed, and their friends feel that way, and it's a sort of vicious cycle.
Yeah, there's an interesting interview that you do with someone who was on one of those student pro-Palestinian encampments during protests, and they were struck, this woman who you spoke to, sorry, I can't remember her name in the piece, she was struck by how something had happened, some terrible thing had happened in Gaza, and the women there were crying, whereas the men were like, oh, let's just talk about the logistics of our next action.
Yeah.
And that, for her, summed up that men couldn't sort of feel what was going on as empathy.
Well, the men actually knew how to tackle it. Men know how to control themselves and say, okay, how do we deal with the problem? And of course, what are you saying? The only empathy these women had were for other women. They have no empathy for the men and boys getting destroyed there, do they? So you're not empathetic.
Pathetically, as women.
Yeah, that was Ash. She was really frustrated with men she worked with in campaigning for Palestine, which was basically her whole life. Like she said that she spent way more time on that than her studies. And she found it very difficult that the men would drop in ways to give speeches and sort of take the limelight, but then they didn't feel as deeply, and she viewed that as a sort of just...
Oh, they were stealing the limelight. Yeah. This is such a projection from your gender.
a failure of empathy, basically. They couldn't quite stretch themselves. It was still about ego, even when, and actually the girls I spoke to at Leeds University as well said that they felt that when men were involved in like social justice issues, it would be by far the most when they're sort of running for politics, like running for the university's Green Society.
Yeah, because social justice isn't social justice. It's man hatred. You'd have to be a fool as a man to involve yourself in it for any other reason than political gain. Because there's no gain for men involving themselves in a hate movement that hates them.
Something they'd be more likely to do that than they would be to do a protest on another issue. They'd never touch feminist society. They wouldn't touch.
Yeah, they wouldn't touch a hate movement against themselves. Wow. Hey, and that's really empathetic from you, by the way. Hey, you say you're empathetic. How do you feel? Put yourself in my shoes. So I'm minding my own business, and some woman hates my guts just because of the way I was born. And then someone like you expects me to support that. I want you to use your empathy and put yourself in my shoes and think what I should say and do.
Social justice issues that don't involve self-promotion. That's their feeling.
And they felt that extended into their personal relationships as well, didn't they? They felt that a man would call out misogyny if they fancied the woman who they were defending, but if not, they weren't.
Yeah, I'm glad that's the case, because you would have to have no self-respect as a man to do it for any other reason. To support something that doesn't even exist, just to bash your own gender.
And really sort of saying things to their friends that, you know, you shouldn't say that.
Yeah. They're very, very frustrated with the young men in their personal lives. They feel like they will make racist jokes and sexist jokes, and they'll laugh at them. They won't stand up unless there's a very specific sexual goal.
Well, Scarlett, you talked about the sort of contrast in terms of class, but actually there's quite interesting stuff coming out of your research about the differences in outlook between white women and those from an ethnic minority background. So you might expect women of colour to be more likely to, you know, to say that they feel the country is racist, for example, because they're more likely to be on the receiving end of racism.
Okay, let's hear this.
But it's actually the opposite.
It is the opposite way around. So yeah, white women in this country, young white women, sorry, I should specify, think that the country is racist. Ethnic minority women do not overall think it is racist. They're actually tied on the question, but they're...
Yeah, exactly. You know why? Because the white women are using racism to virtue signal that they are good people and to attack their men. They hate their men and they're attacking them. And they want to virtue signal that they're actually good people when they're doing bad things. These white women use minority people, minority men especially, when they don't care one iota about them. Matter of fact, they hate minority men. This pretty young white woman here, she does not want a black man from another country, an immigrant, to come onto her. That would grouse her out. She'd be the first to support ICE to deport that guy.
significantly less likely to say that it's racist than their white peers. And I think that's interesting. That's interesting in and of itself. But that it extends.
Well, everything's just it's so interesting, all right? Or it's obviously lies and bullshit.
Into other issues as well. So actually, young ethnic minority women are much more likely to say they feel valued by the country. They're much more likely to say they feel positively about improving their life chances, you know, about things like being in a better position than their parents, about earning.
Yeah, let me guess. These minority women, they come from poor countries and they actually do have issues. They come from poor countries where maybe they did without meals. Maybe they've shivered in the cold. Maybe they couldn't get fresh water. And then they come to these first world countries and say, hey, I don't have time for man hating. I'm so thankful for what I've gotten.
A decent amount, getting a house one day, all of these issues, they feel like they're much more positive and have more of a stake potentially in society, or feel like they do, than their white peers.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Because a lot of the undercurrent of your piece and of your research is that this generation of women don't like the country. They don't feel a sense of national pride. They don't feel like it's giving much to them, and they don't feel like they have a place in this country.
This is bullshit, considering these women have all the advantages over their male peers in this country. The UK is a feminist shithole, and all it does is pander to these women.
Come up.
Yeah, absolutely. Ash said there's nothing for me here. I don't think anyone was positive about Starmer, and you know, these are. I don't think any of them felt positive about Britain in any way. Even if they had personal goals they were excited for, which a lot of them didn't, they didn't feel. They felt incredibly pessimistic about the way the country's going. They were terrified about reform specifically, but even I
wonder what any of this has to do with young women hating men.
Government as it is, which they were just.
But it does highlight the severe privilege these women have and the lack of appreciation they have for anything and their lack of true life problems.
Very, very negative about.
Yeah, and that has implications, real world implications potentially, because one of the reasons they're terrified of reform, and one of the, perhaps one of the reasons why they're reluctant to start a family, is that they don't have much hope in their sort of future economic circumstances, but they're scared that reform might sort of, I don't know, force them into family values that they don't have, for example.
Yes.
And, this is...
Yeah, they might have to sacrifice something for family, and they're not into sacrifice. Sacrifice is for men.
Such a big conversation on the left and right is the falling birth rate. And there's a discrepancy again with how likely young women are to feel that they would like to have children compared to what young men would like.
Yeah, and so we're still talking about quite small numbers here, but young women...
When young men say they want children, most of them means they want a woman. That's what they mean by children. Again, I'll say it over and over again. All kinds of guys deal with sexless marriages where there are no children. These guys want the woman. And as for the woman, the children are only good for using it as leverage towards the man. They don't want to deal with the bothersome pain and work of pregnancy.
Women are much less likely than young men to say they would like children, and again, this is particularly pronounced amongst white women under 30. One in five of whom say they would not like children, and that's not sort of like now. That...
Oh, by the way, ladies, I don't blame you whatsoever for not wanting to have children. Shouldn't be forced on you at all. But I just wanted you to admit that women and motherhood isn't what it's been broken up to be, cracked up to be. You women are not empathetic. You don't care about children. That's fine by me, but be honest.
ever, and obviously they might change their views over time and all the rest of it, but they're sort of starting out their journey in terms of viewing relationships or approaching people with that view in mind, in a way that the young men their age don't seem to be in to the same extent.
Did you speak about starting families with the women that you were talking to?
A lot of them were not sure. Some were anti, a lot weren't sure, but they'd spoken, all of them definitely didn't want kids by 30. And I spoke to one girl who'd done some polling of herself just in her year group. She just asked, and I think she asked like 15 young men and 15 young women, and almost all the young men said they wanted kids by 30, and like basically none of the young women wanted
So
that.
interesting.
And I think,
which of course is selfish in so much as that children are more likely to be born with birth defects the older the woman is. Having children is self-sacrifice. These women aren't into self-sacrifice.
And they would view that as totally like, well, it's men's fault for not doing enough. They see scary things about trad wives on the internet.
Right.
They see scary things about reform. They see
When they say trad wives are scary, that means the women are held to some kind of responsibility. And in their view, getting together with the man is being a master with a slave. He is responsible for everything. She's responsible for nothing. And she's seen these so-called trad wives where guys are expecting something from their wives. They're expecting a quid pro quo, which actually doesn't exist in their marriage, but still, they're expecting it.
Maternity pronatalist policies that scare them. They see things about abortion rights that scare them, and it's just, there's not really an obvious, they don't see.
Abortion's rights isn't a right. It is actually it's actually control over the life and death of other people. And they're saying, these men are saying, no, the child's life is valuable beyond you, the woman. And if you become pregnant, that's another person, and that other person deserves to live. They're saying everything doesn't revolve around you. So again, this is all about a woman saying, I'm afraid the man, my manslave, actually believes he has rights in our relationship.
See any obvious reason to have it.
And so this gets in the way of relationships between young men and women, presumably, although some of the women you spoke to did go out with men. But also it has implications in terms of party politics. I think every interviewee in your piece were talking about voting Green, I think, or potentially Labour. Have you noticed a split in terms of voting intention?
There is a split in terms of voting intention. And again, it's not the split that people think necessarily. I mean, it is and it isn't. So I think, again, they were part of this narrative about young men, and actually Reform themselves were leaning into this because I think, it helped them to feel like they were very, had a huge appeal amongst young men, even if not young women. But actually, young men are still less likely to vote for Reform than any other generation of men. They're some of the least likely to vote Reform in the country. Most voting intention polls actually have young men just as likely to vote Green as Reform, if not more likely to vote for the Greens. So, it's not that this is being driven by young men.
Oh, by the way, guys, I don't know what to say here because I'm not familiar with British politics. I don't know what the Green Party stands for. I'm guessing Labour stands for the working man. And if the Labour stands for the working man and supports feminism, they're against the working man. Like I said, I don't know if that's the case.
In terms of their voting going dramatically to the right. But what is happening is that young women are in huge numbers going to the left. Now, we could even see this was visible at the last election, even when the Greens didn't do very well.
Feminism. They're not going to the left. They're not left-wing. Women who lack empathy and bash men are not left-wing. They're not progressive. They're going to the feminism in the left wing.
overall, or they had the best electoral performance, but still not the sorts of numbers we're now seeing in the polls. And that has only grown since then. And I think when you look into their views of these figures and these parties, and I think what's quite interesting is, I think what we're getting at is, it's not just political questions. Their politics are underpinned by their values, which they don't want to compromise on, and which they hold very closely. Their ideological and cultural values comes first and politics second. And partly as a result of that, they are relentlessly negative about Keir Starmer, about the Labour Party, and I think a lot of this hasn't been priced in because
what's their issue with the Labour Party? Again, guys, I don't know exactly what the Labour Party stands for or what their issues with it. So these women are talking about things that in Britain people would understand what she means. I'm not sure I understand what she means. But if the Labour Party is for the working man and these women are against the Labour Party,
a lot of Labour, or I think they may be waking up to it now, but just think these women will come home. I think they just think, they're a bit cross. Okay, fine. They don't like us very much. They don't like all the stuff we did with the flag. Whatever it is. But ultimately, they will come back to us, because that's what young women and sort of slightly older young women do. And actually, what we're seeing is that it looks like they're just going to go further away.
Yes, it's really interesting, because I do remember sort of in the Cameron years writing about David Cameron's woman problem, and the Conservatives could never sort of do better among women than Labour could, and perhaps there's still that old assumption in the Labour Party that eventually women will come back to them and there's not really anywhere else for them to go.
I think a lot of people have assumed that for a long time, and I think they're going to we'll see in how greater numbers they vote, for example, because turnout can be quite low amongst younger groups. But
maybe I should have stopped it long ago, because again, they have a specific title here. Why do young women hate men? And what they're talking about here has nothing to do with that title.
I think there could be some people I think could be in for quite a nasty surprise about how hard it is to get those voters back.
Yeah, and generally I know that we used to talk about this, the motivating voting issues for women voters, usually similar to men, but, perhaps a bit.
Well, I shouldn't say that. It does, but they're not going to explain it. Do these parties that the guys like have some kind of limitations or boundaries on women's behaviors? If they do, that's why the women are rejecting it.
More emphasis on the NHS, childcare, schooling, the things that they might be more involved in their family setup than the men might. In terms of this generation, these Gen Z women that we're talking about, are the motivating factors the things that we've been talking about, climate change, how they feel about Israel, Palestine, Trump, those kind of issues? Yeah,
definitely. So they're still they're very much concerned.
Can I ask you something, gals? Blood diamonds. Remember the old movie Blood Diamonds? Where it's, there's supposed to be empathy for these people who suffer, these men who suffer in the mines. Did diamonds stop being bought by women? Or should be, say, accepted by women? Did De Beers drop in its sales? Yes, these women are for Palestine right now, but is there any self-sacrifice involved in that? Or will they just forget it in a year or two when it's passé?
About the cost of living, and again, but they firmly see the solution to that through a redistributive lens. That's what they would like to see, and they're very agitated about housing costs and things like that. They would be a fan of Zach Polansky's policy announcements about rent controls, for example. So it's sort of economics, but with that spin on it. And then otherwise, you're absolutely right. Issues that are more important to them absolutely include things like the Israel-Gaza conflict, much more important to young women than it is for a lot of the rest of the population. And then they do loathe Donald Trump, and they are genuinely fearful of Donald Trump. And I was speaking to some in focus groups actually in London over the last couple of weeks, and they actually even were saying, well, we don't want the country, even though we're really cross, we actually don't want the country to get weaker because that will help Donald Trump. So, that they are framing quite a lot of our national politics in terms of what's going on in America. And I think that is partly because that's what a lot of their media, we're talking about online. A lot of that is framed in terms of American politics and their political discussions.
Yeah, well, what can I say? UK is a little bitch boy to the United States. What can I say? But I mean, just talking about Trump is pretty shallow. Like he's just a figurehead. What's going on in the United States government? I mean, if that's the depth you can talk about, is Donald Trump. There's no depth to it at all.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think particularly on the right of politics, there's this image of sort of overeducated young women who come out of university with these kind of radical political opinions, and they're the reason why we're not
They're
getting.
not radical political opinions. Your hatred towards us guys is undeserved and innate. It's not radical. It's very common.
Enough babies born and that kind of thing. I mean, is there any sort of grain of truth in that? Frankly,
I mean, I do think they probably are, maybe perhaps they are spending more time online, and that's why that's part, and
Are you telling these young women to touch grass? I mean, you've got a podcast that's online. Who's going to watch you if they're all out there touching grass?
that message is being reinforced. Universities are left wing. They're with a group.
No, universities aren't left wing, they're right wing. All those young women demand traditional roles for men. They demand them. The man serves. They are not progressive. They're not liberal. They're not left wing.
People who feel the same, it becomes a bubble where they think that. I mean,
you do have those differences of opinion between the ones with degrees and
they're in a bubble where people think like that. I mean, it's natural to look at America and be scared of it. I think America came up a lot with everyone. They were all worried about Trump. They take it as almost as much as like Britain. It's a problem for them.
This is what annoys me about women's problem with Trump. They don't really care so much that Trump is destroying the world, actually, damaging the world trade as it is. The thing that pissed them off about Donald Trump is that he once said something true about women, which was negative. That women would allow him to feel them up because he was such a high status man. That was actually true. And that was the beginning of the hatred towards him. You know something, I kind of wonder, guys, if Trump was complete submissive to women, would they care as much that he's destroying, or I should say, causing damage worldwide? Would they care as much? Or would they support him as long as he was kissing their asses? This is what I'm trying to talk about right here. This is my point.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily blame them for it because when you speak to them, you just feel they're quite compelling about all these issues. They describe, graduating into a world where they're watching war on the internet, that they feel like their government doesn't get them.
Really, war on the internet. So if the internet didn't exist, it would be okay. I mean, women shipped their sons off to war since the dawn of humanity. And they didn't think anything twice of it.
And it doesn't care about the things they care about, and young men don't care about the things they care about. You feel very sympathetic towards them because they're identifying real issues, and if they want to opt out, why not? But obviously, it has very bad ramifications for...
What do you mean women opt out? The whole world is catered to you. They're not opting out of anything.
British society of one group so alienated.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because I think you mentioned it, Scarlett, but the way that they feel more positively about communism and socialism than they do about capitalism.
Again, they're just virtue signaling. These women, when they select a man, they will select a hardcore capitalist who brings home the most bacon. Women's hypergamy will prevent communism from ever existing anywhere. What'd you say? They're angry with guys because they're not making enough money to give them a bride. So those guys have to work within a capitalist system to try to bribe these women.
Is that right?
Yeah,
It's
they
quite a big
do.
shift, isn't it?
That is, yeah. I mean, I was quite so. Overall, women have a sort of we say +2 view of capitalism, so just about in net positive.
Right.
But they have a much more favourable view of communism. It's on +11. So
Women love bashing capitalism on a verbal level, but they love living in it. They love living in a luxurious capitalistic society. That is their dream. What do you think Grimm's fairy tales was all about? It was about the pauper girl becoming the princess and marrying the prince. It wasn't about making the country a better place. It's about her elevating her status.
they do feel much more favourably inclined towards communism. One of the interesting divides I found, because I do think, what you're just saying, it depends what spin you want to put on it, but the data does bear out that, especially white, but, middle class, educated women do feel these things more strongly than the rest of that cohort. But what's really interesting as well, I think, is that there's a huge difference between what I call like the COVID, or many people call the COVID generation,
Right,
and their slightly older peers. So if we break out the sort of 18 to 25 year olds versus the 25 to 30 year olds, the 18 to 25 year olds feel these things much more extremely. And with the 18 to 25 year olds, so poor is their view of capitalism that they actually have as favourable view of fascism. Now, I'm not suggesting that all these under 25s are fascists. They are very clearly not. They're very, very far from that. but I thought that was the bit that really made my jaw drop.
These women, the average woman is feminist, and that's fascist. Do you believe in feminists? Are you a feminist, young lady? Then you're a fascist.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I suppose we haven't talked about COVID, but that's such a big percentage of some of these women's lives.
Really? So is COVID the reason why they hate young men?
They're so young, and it was their formative years that were impacted by this, whether they were at university or whether they're at school. How far did you find that being something that they would sort of refer back to as the thing that kind of radicalized them? Sounds pejorative, but sort of led them to where they are now.
I really think that is a massive factor in it. I mean, they didn't cite it so much, but you have to think, well, because I'm 28, so I'm just sort of just a bit older than these people. And
Can I ask you, ladies, how come, you're always so concerned about de-radicalizing young guys? It's so important to you that young men aren't radicalized. Well, here you're saying these women are radicalized. I don't hear any talk about de-radicalizing them. We've got to do something about these young women who are radicalized.
at school, I was part of these feminist society, and at university.
There you go. Then you're a fascist. Thank you for admitting that. And you're a capitalist. You're a far-right authoritarian, regressive. Thank you.
These kind of protests. I was sort of in that kind of world, but I was trying to think, what's the difference between my experience of it, where everyone was talking about progressive things and fourth wave feminism and all that stuff. What's the difference between that?
Progressive things like kicking young men out of university or giving women work quotas to prevent men from getting their earned job. Is this what you consider progressive?
And these people now, and it is just that this overwhelming bleakness that I don't recognize that at all from when I was at school and when I was at university. I don't remember this sense of being totally done with men. I think people were angry about things and people were excited about new ideas, and it was sort of
and there were
books to read. There were all these
journalists writing, interesting new things. Everyday sexism was suddenly a concept that you might not have used before, like that phrase.
Totally, Me Too, Rose for BLM. There were all these movements.
Men suffer everyday sexism. Not you, not your gender, my gender.
and all these new concepts like microaggressions, all this stuff. And it was, we learned.
Men don't suffer microaggressions. We suffer macroaggressions, like your attack on our human rights.
About all of it. I don't remember the nihilism and the negativity. That I don't remember. And I do think, I mean, I think the war in Gaza is another big thing that probably made them feel really detached. But I think COVID, I mean, that time feeling alone and isolated and watching more and more on the internet and getting more segregated, I just think that's a huge difference.
Yeah. And lastly, I mean, is there anything, I mean, it's pretty bleak for Labour, isn't it? Because they feel so sort of pessimistic about the current government. What would you do if you were in Starmer's team and you were looking at these figures? I mean, is there anything that could win these women back?
I think it's very difficult to know, and I think the problem they will have is if they.
As a male politician, why would I care about winning a bunch of man haters back?
I think firstly that these women do. I think until sort of Zach Plansky and the Green Party, which is a very new phenomenon and hasn't even filtered down to a lot of these young women yet. I think the ones you spoke to very positively, but it's still not actually hugely known amongst the public. So I think that we will see that accelerate over the next year. But no one's been trying to speak to them, I think. No one's been sort of acknowledging that they feel locked out of or at odds with society. I do think it is difficult, though, because they increasingly look like a sort of unreconcilable part of the coalition, if that makes sense, because of the things that are most important to them. I suspect if you're in parts of Labour...
You mean themselves? That's what's important to them, just themselves. So it's going to be irreconcilable if you want someone who doesn't care about anything other than their own personal self-interest. And they have no empathy for others. They can't think outside of themselves.
There'll be parts of Labour that strongly agree with them on lots of this, by the way. You know, some of the PLP and things like that I think will have a huge amount of sympathy for these young women's views. But it's difficult when if
you have sympathy for these man haters, well, you're definitely my enemy.
These young women are holding dear to them and things they won't compromise on, which are then toxic to other parts of the electorate. You know, so I think it's a very difficult balancing act for Labour specifically, although it's something that Labour...
Yeah, you know, it's hard to balancing act to get the KKK members in. You know, Labour, they want those KKK members so badly.
The Greens, I think, you know, the next election is increasingly look like a battle between coalitions. They're going to have to, whatever sort of...
Okay, that's it. It's what? Less than half a minute? The rest of it was pretty well junk. I could have stopped it after the first 4.5 minutes, but I went all the way. Why do young women hate men? Because it's just innate to you. And of course, you don't want to just say that. It would make you feel bad. Don't look in the mirror and decide, maybe I could change. Maybe I could fight my evil instincts, my sexist instincts. No, but you will get in a panel with other women in this posh atmosphere and just talk about things, because that is the lifestyle I see from the average woman. Anyway, we'll end it here.